very warm welcome. I'm so glad you could join us today. We're going to take a closer look at a topic that's really essential for anyone involved in international trade finance. We'll be talking about the rules for handling paperwork when things don't go exactly to plan, focusing on a very important rule called UCP 600, Article 16.
So, let's start with a question. It might sound a little dramatic, but it's a real-world scenario in global trade. Can one tiny, seemingly harmless typo on a document actually put a multi-million-dollar deal at risk? The answer, surprisingly, is yes, absolutely. You see, in the world of international trade, being precise isn't just a nice-to-have, it's a must-have. And when that precision is missing, it can set off a whole chain of problems.
And that really gets us to the heart of the problem. You see, in many of these big international deals, payments are secured using something called a letter of credit. Just think of it as a promise from a bank. The bank promises to pay the seller, but only if the seller provides a very specific stack of documents that prove they've shipped the goods. Now, here's the key thing to understand. Banks don't check the cargo. They don't look at the products. They deal only with the documents. So if that paperwork has errors, which the industry calls discrepancies, the whole payment process can grind to a halt. And that means delays, disputes, and a lot of financial risk for everyone involved.
So to make this whole area a lot clearer, we're going to walk through the main rule that governs all of this, UCP 600, Article 16. Here's a quick roadmap of what we'll cover. First, we'll look at what a paperwork problem actually is. Second, we'll go through the very strict procedure a bank has to follow when it finds one. Third, we'll explore the buyer's option to forgive or waive those mistakes. Fourth, we'll unpack the serious penalty a bank faces if it doesn't follow its own rules perfectly. And finally, we'll go over some common questions to make sure everything is clear. By the end of this, you'll have a really solid, step-by-step grasp of this whole process.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning. What kind of paperwork error are we actually talking about here?
The main term you need to know is discrepancy. The easiest way to think about it is this. The letter of credit is like a super strict checklist. A discrepancy is when the documents the seller hands over don't perfectly match every single little detail on that checklist. It's not about being close enough, it has to be an exact, perfect match. Any mistake, any missing piece of information, any kind of non-compliance, it doesn't matter how small it seems, it's officially a discrepancy.
And these errors can be unbelievably minor. For example, let's say a letter of credit states that the seller's name is Black Stars with an S on the end. But on the invoice they submit, it's spelled Black Star without the S. That single missing letter, just one character, is enough to make the entire set of documents discrepant. And because of that one little error, the bank now has the right to refuse payment. It's a perfect example of why paying attention to every single detail is so important.
Okay, so now we see how a discrepancy can happen. Let's move on to our next key idea. Once a bank spots an error like that, a very strict, time-sensitive process kicks in.
The moment the documents arrive at the bank, a clock starts ticking. The bank has a maximum of 5 banking days to review everything. And it's important to know, banking days means days the bank is actually open for business, so weekends and holidays don't count. But within those 5 business days, the bank has to examine the documents and make a decision. Do they comply or not? They can't just sit on the documents forever. That 5-day window is a hard deadline.
Now, if the bank finds discrepancies and decides to refuse payment, it has to send out a formal refusal notice. And this notice has to be perfect. It has 3 mandatory parts. First, it has to say very clearly that the bank is refusing to pay. No room for confusion. Second, and this is really important for the seller, it must list every single discrepancy the bank found. It can't just be vague and say documents are wrong. It has to be specific, like beneficiary name is misspelled on the invoice. This gives the seller a clear picture of what went wrong. And third, the notice has to say what the bank is physically doing with the documents. Are they sending them back? Are they holding on to them for now? All 3 of these parts are absolutely required.
But you know, a refusal from the bank isn't always the end of the line. There's another path that can be taken when documents have errors, and this brings us to what's called the buyer's waiver option. A waiver is basically the buyer giving the bank permission to ignore the mistakes. The applicant, that's the official term for the buyer in this process, can agree to just overlook the discrepancies and tell their bank to pay the seller anyway. Now, why would they do that? Well, it almost always comes down to business. Maybe the ship with their goods is already sitting at the port and they need the documents to get their stuff through customs. In a situation like that, delaying payment over a tiny typo could cost them a lot more in storage fees than just accepting the documents as they are.
It's also important to understand who does what here. It's the issuing bank, the buyer's bank, that talks to the buyer to get this waiver. Other banks in the transaction usually can't contact the buyer directly. A good practical example is if an invoice amount is just a little bit higher than what the letter of credit allows. The buyer might agree to waive that because blocking the payment would only stop them from getting the goods they urgently need.
This brings us to probably the most critical part of this whole process. We've seen the strict procedure the bank has to follow, but what happens if the bank doesn't follow it perfectly? This is where the preclusion rule comes into play.
The preclusion rule is basically the ultimate penalty for the bank. What it says is that if a bank fails to follow that procedure we just talked about, if it takes more than 5 banking days or if its refusal notice is incomplete, then that bank is precluded. That's a legal term that just means they're stopped or forbidden from claiming the documents have any errors at all. In other words, they completely lose their right to complain.
Basically, the bank loses its right to refuse, period. It is legally required to pay the seller even if the documents have real, significant errors. The forfeiture clause analogy is perfect. If the bank, which is supposed to be the referee here, makes a procedural mistake, it automatically loses. It forfeits its right to object, and the payment has to be made. This is a powerful rule, and it exists to make sure banks are incredibly careful, transparent, and precise in their work.
Okay, to help make sure all these important ideas really stick, let's just run through a few of the most common questions people have about this whole procedure.
All right, first question. Does the bank have all the time in the world to decide if it's going to accept or refuse documents? The answer is a definite no. As we've covered, the absolute maximum is 5 banking days from the day after they receive them. Second question. Let's say a bank finds one error on day 2 and then another error on day 4. Can it send 2 different notices? Again, the answer is no. The rule is very strict here. The bank must send one single notice that lists all of the discrepancies it has found.
Next up, is a vague reason like just saying data is conflicting good enough for a refusal notice? Not at all. The notice has to be specific about each and every error for it to be valid. And our final and most important review question, what's the ultimate consequence if a bank fails to follow these procedures correctly? Well, as we've just learned, the bank is precluded. It loses its right to refuse the documents and is legally required to make the payment.
So let's do a quick recap of the 3 most important takeaways from our look at Article 16. First, the time limit. Always remember that strict 5 banking day deadline for the bank. Second, the notice. If a bank is going to refuse, it has to be done with a single specific notice that lists everything. And third, the penalty. Any failure by the bank to follow this procedure triggers that powerful preclusion rule, which means the bank has to pay no matter what errors are in the documents.
And all of this leads to one final important thought. We've seen how strict these rules are and how a small mistake can create big problems. This brings up a really good question for anyone involved in trade. How can buyers and sellers work together better before a letter of credit is even created to try and minimize these risks right from the start? There's no single easy answer to that, and honestly, we'd love to hear your own thoughts and experiences on this. Please share them in the comments below. And of course, feel free to leave any other questions you might have about this topic. If you found this guide helpful, we would really appreciate it if you'd like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into how trade finance really works. Thank you so much for your time and for watching today.